Hi, I'm Dan Malott with Valley In-Flight Training. Today we would like to take just a few minutes and talk to you about 3 simple things that you can add to your tool belt for safety on your next flight. They're airspeed, directional control, and decision making. Airspeed, directional control, and decision making added up for a safer flight. So let's talk about airspeed. Airspeed awareness and airspeed control. The big rage right now is AOA, or angle of attack indicators. Those are great tools for great pilots, but the key is training on an AOA indicator. If you don't have an AOA indicator, or you don't have the money to install one in your aircraft, you can still add to your safety toolbox by airspeed awareness and airspeed control. Let's talk about 3 things when it comes to airspeed awareness and control. Airspeed on takeoff, airspeed in emergencies, and airspeeds on approach and landing. Let's talk about takeoff and departure. You should always know through pre-flight planning and preparation what your minimum airspeed is for a safe operation. The airlines and corporate pilots, they have profiles that they'll fly with where they know what airspeed to rotate, what airspeed to climb out low to the ground, and what climb airspeed they'll use. Now, we need to convert that into our personal flying. So for your aircraft, make sure that you have an appropriate airspeed that you're constantly aware of, that is at least a safe minimum airspeed such as VYSE, VY, or VXSE or VX, and then what you'll use for cruise climb. And more importantly is to always be aware of what your climb airspeed is. That means constantly checking your airspeed for any given situation in flight. So airspeed on takeoff and climb. The next one is airspeed control in an emergency. And those may be things such as engine failures, or any type of fire, or any abnormality that may cause you to look away from your instrument panel. It's critical that under any emergency, you constantly maintain airspeed. If you have airspeed, you can do a lot with an airplane. If you get too slow, there's a lot of bad things that can happen to your airplane very quickly. So maintaining airspeed in an emergency. And the last one is airspeed on approach and landing. This is one of the most common things that we've talked about probably since the beginning of your private training, the importance of airspeed control on approach and landing. And again, it's really not rocket science. We need to maintain an appropriate airspeed for the given situation in flight. That could be a normal traffic pattern. That could be an instrument approach in icing conditions. Any situation that you're flying, you have to be aware of what your airspeed should be. Airspeed awareness and then airspeed control. There have been too many accidents of pilots that maybe level off at an MDA in icing conditions and fail to add enough power to maintain altitude. They lose the airspeed awareness and they stall spin the aircraft into the ground. So always being aware of what your appropriate airspeed should be and what your airspeed is. It's the airspeed awareness and then the resultant airspeed control. So that's airspeed. The next one is directional control. There's been also a huge talk from the NTSB in our industry about loss of directional control accidents. So I'd like to talk to you about 3 situations for directional control and the importance of it. One is directional control on takeoff and departure, directional control during emergency operations, and directional control on approach and landing. So let's talk about directional control on takeoff. One of the most critical factors on a takeoff is in particular a crosswind or an engine failure on a multi-engine airplane that causes a change in the direction of the airplane. Those 2 things cause far too many accidents on takeoff and shortly after. So it's important to always remember your crosswind takeoff technique. Far too often, pilots will input the crosswind when they look at the windsock, which you should always do right before takeoff, apply the correction, and then they naturally roll it out to almost neutral by the time they rotate. This may or may not work depending on the strength of your crosswind. If you're taking off where we're at in North Dakota, you may experience a 20+ knot crosswind. Taking all of your crosswind component out at the time of rotation can easily cause you to lose directional control, or worse yet, put a side load and cause a collapse of a gear. It's important that you remember to maintain the appropriate crosswind correction up to and including your rotation speed. So remember, airspeed control, or correction, directional control on takeoff. Now, let's say that we're just after liftoff and we lose an engine. Let's move into emergencies, directional control on emergencies. One of the key losses of control is when I lose an engine on a multi-engine airplane. And unfortunately, far too often, pilots try to do something. And as many old multi-engine instructors will tell you, if you have an engine failure, the most important thing you can do in any situation is to fly your airplane. Fly the airplane. In fact, if you do nothing at all except fly the airplane and maintain airspeed, you can do a lot with an airplane, even in an emergency. As an old instructor used to tell me, if you have air over the wings and air over the tail, you're going to be okay. So let's make sure that if we have an emergency, such as an engine failure or a fire or any given situation, we make sure that we have the proper airspeed and directional control. So if you're in a multi-engine airplane, such as a King Air, and you lose an engine, before you start doing something, fly the airplane. If you can fly the airplane straight ahead and maintain a safe airspeed at or above VYSE, you'll be safe. That will allow you time to make decisions, to maybe shut down an engine if you need to find a place to land if you don't have climb performance. Whatever it is, make sure that you fly the airplane first, and then you can make a decision. So that's our directional control in an emergency. The last one is directional control on approach and landing. It's directly related to airspeed. Far too many pilots are getting slow and losing control of their airplane. We can't stress enough the importance of awareness of your airspeed, or if you have an AOA indicator, AOA awareness, and then airspeed and AOA control. Making sure that at all times you maintain air over the wings and air over the tail so that you don't lose control of the airplane. Yes, we occasionally see an airplane come in too fast, and they may run off the end of the runway. That does happen. But typically, those aren't the fatal accidents we read about where someone loses control because they're too slow on final and they stall spin into the ground. Typically, those result in fatalities. So the most important part is to maintain air over the wings and air over the tail. And we do that by always maintaining an awareness of what our airspeed should be and what our airspeed is now. Pilots do this all the time in the airlines, in the corporate world. It's called VREF. We fly a published VREF speed. Typically, they have an extra pilot, a pilot who's not flying, but is monitoring. We call it the pilot monitoring. And they're watching the airspeed, and they're giving call-outs if that airspeed gets too slow or the AOA is in a dangerous situation. If we're flying single pilot, it's up to us. We need to maintain at all times airspeed awareness or AOA awareness, and then airspeed or AOA control. It's critical to maintain directional control. The last one then is decision making. And we'd like to point out 3 easy areas that cause a lot of accidents that you can do on your next flight. Decision making for fuel planning, decision making for weather avoidance, and the last one is takeoff decision making. Let's talk briefly about decision making with regards to fuel. Far too many pilots don't do a simple thing, and that is, how much gas do I have and how much gas do I need? That simple step may sound a little bit ridiculous or a little facetious, but far too many pilots have assumed they were topped off, when in fact maybe the line person didn't top them off. Or they thought they had topped off, but they had made an intermediate stop and they forgot that they were not topped off at that location. Or perhaps it was a miscommunication of fueling. Either way, it is critical that every time the pilot in command gets in that aircraft, we check the fuel on board and how much fuel it will take. And of course, adding our necessary reserves. And when you use reserves, let's also use some common sense. If we're flying in a mountainous terrain and the weather is right around minimums or forecasted to be around minimums, let's make sure that we don't just have that 45-minute reserve. Let's be a little safer and add in enough to realistically fly to that location, descend down, shoot an approach, go missed approach, climb back up and using climb power fuel, holding to make a decision for some time, then diverting to your alternate, and then shooting an approach down to your alternate, and then maintaining that 45 minutes beyond that. Let's make sure we're using realistic reserves and realistic minimum fuel. The next one is weather and weather decision making. We have a lot of pilots that fly airplanes, particularly private pilots, flying into dangerous weather. Professional pilots, such as airlines and corporate operators, they have sophisticated equipment, and you may have that same equipment on board your aircraft. But they use that equipment to stay away from dangerous weather. In the summer, that means convective weather. In the winter, we're looking for things like freezing rain or dangerous icing. But it's so critical that we look before we go fly to find those critical areas of weather that can get us into trouble. In the summer, it's convective activity, staying away from convective activity. If you have XM, if you have radar, we're looking at the radar before we go. We want to stay away from any convective activity. Even if it shows green or yellow on the radar screen, doesn't mean safe. It does not mean safe. It, in fact, could rapidly build, especially if you use XM. XM is a delayed image that could easily have built into a red cell that could cause damage or worse, a fatality. So we need to make sure that we stay away from convective activity, and in the winter we need to watch out for severe icing, and we always need to have an out of icing. The last thing that we need to do before we fly is takeoff decision making. Takeoff decision making. This is again related to our airspeed and directional control, but I want to make sure that I have a plan before I add takeoff thrust or takeoff power. That plan should include, what am I going to do on takeoff if I lose an engine or have a fire or any other abnormality? When is the point that I would continue a takeoff if I have an emergency in a multi-engine airplane? I should review my takeoff performance. If I lose an engine after takeoff, what is my takeoff performance today? How much single engine climb rate do I have? Some multi-engine piston airplanes at an airport such as Denver or any mountainous or high density altitude airport may not have single engine climb performance, in which case I need to have a plan. If I'm on takeoff and I lose an engine after gear retraction and I don't have single engine climb performance, I have to make sure that I maintain airspeed, I maintain directional control, and I find that place to land for a forced landing. A forced landing in an aircraft is a heck of a lot better than losing control of your airplane into a stall spin accident. So, for today, my name is Dan, this is Valley In-Flight Training, and we've been talking to you today about airspeed, directional control, and decision making, ADD, added up for a safe flight today. Thank you, and visit our website, www.flyvift.com.